everyone, this is MC Squared. Well, with Saving Mr. Banks now in theaters, it is now New Year's Eve, the time of this recording. We've now been exposed to an infamous tale of an author who absolutely detested the critically acclaimed, groundbreaking, well-regarded film adaptation of their work, P.L. Travers and Mary Poppins. But you know, this isn't the only such tale. There was actually quite a few. I mean, there are authors such as J.K. Rowling who just adore and support the films based on their works, and even Michael Crichton, to my knowledge, supported the Jurassic Park films even though they had to be changed around in adaptation. But then there are people like Travers who just so utterly despise the film versions of their works, even though the films are considered classics, masterpieces, or otherwise cult favorites. So, let's have a look at some other such cases. First, some honorable mentions. I can't get too in-depth with these, even though they're quite notable, because, well, I haven't seen them. Or if I have, only bits and pieces. Don't fault me for that, I'm only human, and I don't really have the time and money to watch every movie ever made. Unlike some more successful web critics. Kudos! I know of them, of course, and their reputations, so I'm gonna do my best to summarize best I can. First, I'd like to mention Forrest Gump, of course a landmark film starring Tom Hanks as an idiot savant with exceptional running speed and ping pong skills who becomes a successful soldier and ends up meeting and in some instances affecting just about every major celebrity and US president of the time period. The film was of course a massive success and technical achievement and won 6 Oscars. None of whose speeches gave mention to the author of the novel it's based on, Winston Groom. Groom was paid $350,000 for the screenplay rights and was promised 3% of the film's profits, which he didn't receive. Paramount actually claimed to him that the movie lost money, which is laughable considering Tom Hanks received points instead of salary, scoring over $20 million. Groom, of course, took the whole situation to court, which lasted years, and he was so upset that the very first line of his sequel, Gump and Company, was, "Don't never let nobody make a movie of your life story." Then there's Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, the first installment being adapted as the highly successful Interview with the Vampire, starring Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Christian Slater, Kirsten Dunst, and Antonio Banderas. This is rather a funny case because, well, the end outcome and punchline of this isn't considered a good film. Let's start from the beginning. See, before the film was completed, Anne Rice, who also wrote the screenplay, was so vocally against the casting of Tom Cruise, putting forth, "I was particularly stunned by the casting of Cruise, who is no more my vampire Lestat than Edward G. Robinson is Rhett Butler." Needless to say, she was outraged for months and making quite a spectacle of herself. Then she saw the film and, well, she was won over by it. She ended up liking it. But now the punchline comes up. See, years later, an adaptation was produced of the 3rd installment of the Vampire Chronicles, Queen of the Damned, which had none of the same production crew or cast, and was critically panned. During production and promotion of the film, Anne Rice was actually quite supportive. But about 2 years later, she had become quite loathsome of the film and encourages her fans to stay away from it, even on her Facebook page. Now onto the real meat. Let's start off with the topic starter, P.L. Travers and Mary Poppins. You could just see Saving Mr. Banks for yourselves, but I don't know exactly how much of the film is historically accurate. I'm not a film historian, I'm just a guy with a search engine. But what I do know is that, yes, Walt Disney lobbied for 20 years to get the film rights to the Poppins books, and yes, Travers turned him down for years. When finally approved, she was brought on as a consultant with script approval and objected to everything from the animated sequence to the Sherman Brothers songs. Honestly, I'm unsure of Saving Mr. Banks' accuracy in depicting the Sherman Brothers winning her over with "Let's Go Fly a Kite." I've been told that P.L. Travers seems to have had the mindset that morons are anyone who isn't P.L. Travers, which is certainly how she appears to be portrayed in the film. In the end, while she had script approval, she didn't have final draft approval, whatever that's supposed to mean. So all her desires were ultimately ignored by the filmmakers. She didn't even receive an invite to the world premiere. She had to ask to be invited. Even at the premiere, she demanded to Walt Disney that the entire animated sequence had to go, to which Walt simply walked away saying, "That ship has sailed." She reportedly came out of the movie in tears, although it wasn't tears of thinking of her father as depicted in Saving Mr. Banks. She was just so appalled by the production. Next, let's talk about the Hanna-Barbera classic adaptation of Charlotte's Web. I think most people these days have seen this at a young age, and I believe it's pretty generally well-liked. I can't say much for the 2006 live-action telling starring Dakota Fanning because, honestly, I haven't seen it. But as to the original, well, author E.B. White was not a fan, saying, "The story is interrupted every few minutes so that somebody can sing a jolly song. I don't care much for jolly songs. The Blue Hill Fair, which I tried to report faithfully in the book, has become a Disney World with 76 trombones. But that's what you get for getting embroiled in Hollywood." Ouch. Then there's the Chuck Jones animated, with some live-action segments, adaptation of The Phantom Tollbooth, starring Eddie Munster himself, Butch Patrick, and featuring an impressive voice cast, including notables such as Mel Blanc, Dawes Butler, June Foray, Candy Candido, and Captain Hook himself, Hans Conried.
By the 4,827,659 hairs on my head, I'll tell you what's important.
I should point out that this film has an astonishing 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Great stuff. And while I believe author Norton Juster was pretty accepting of Chuck Jones's earlier Academy Award-winning adaptation of The Dot and the Line, of which Juster wrote the screenplay, he describes the Phantom Tollbooth adaptation, of which he had no involvement, as, well, rubbish. Saying, "It was a film I never liked. I don't think they did a good job on it. It's been around for a long time. It was well reviewed, which also made me angry." Bitter much? And of course there's the horror classic adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, and Jazz himself, Scatman Crothers.
#1 superstar. Hong Kong Phooey, quicker than the human eye.
Stephen King, however, was less than favorable to the film, to the point where he himself went as far as to make a TV miniseries adaptation in an attempt to fix what he felt was broken. The Nostalgia Critic already did a breakdown of that mess, so you can go watch that. King's big criticism stemmed from that Kubrick's version seemed to downplay the more supernatural elements of the novel, and he greatly disliked the casting of Nicholson, saying that it made Jack Torrance feel like an obvious psychopath to begin with. Even Ken Kesey disapproved of Nicholson's Academy Award-winning performance of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, saying he would have preferred someone more like Gene Hackman. Truth be told, he never actually saw the movie, to my knowledge. While I do somewhat agree with Stephen King to a point, and even the Nostalgia Critic agreed that the one thing the miniseries seemed to get right was its more natural depiction of an everyman father being slowly driven to psychotic madness, you can't deny Nicholson gave a boffo performance. You can tell he's giving his all and is loving every single minute of it. Then there's, well, just about every adaptation of an Alan Moore work. Now, I won't deny that Alan Moore is a fantastic comic book writer, my favorite work being the Batman story The Killing Joke. But to me, Moore comes across as a pretentious snob, and even, let's be honest, a little scary.
My name's Alan Moore. I write comics.
For example, in 2012, a series of prequels to the critically acclaimed Watchmen, titled Before Watchmen, was released, headed by accomplished comic book writers such as Darwin Cook, J. Michael Straczynski, and Watchmen's original editor Len Wein, among others. Moore, however, called the whole project completely shameless, refusing any compensation and saying, "What the comics industry has effectively said is, yes, this was the only book that made us briefly special, and that was because it wasn't like all the other books. Watchmen was something that stood on its own and had the integrity of a literary work. What they've decided now is, so let's change it into a regular comic book that can run indefinitely and have spin-offs, and let's make it as unexceptionable as possible." Like I say, they're doing this because they haven't got any other choices left, evidently. Now, hold on. I can agree to this somewhat, and I know Watchmen was a critically acclaimed series. I love it myself. But that was the only thing that made comics special? Really? I'm pretty sure there have been other noteworthy, award-winning graphic literature comparable to Watchmen. On the one hand, you can side with his argument saying DC is selling out on his work. On the other, it seems like a compelling way of more saying, me, my work, mine, leave it alone, mine, refusing other accomplished writers and artists to take a bite of the apple of a work they respect and enjoy. And honestly, I remember reading positive feedback of the before Watchmen installment Minutemen by New Frontier writer and artist Darwin Cook. Hell, most of the before Watchmen titles were positively received, with exceptions. Now, you know me, I've always defended George Lucas on his artistic integrity, how until recently Star Wars has been his work to do what he sees fit. But he's never denied allowing expanded universe material to be written, and plus, he has willingly sold the property to Disney, willingly allowing other talents into the playpen. With more, it feels like, you can own my work, DC, but don't do anything with it. Don't touch it, it's mine. You hear me? Mine!
It's mine, you understand? Mine, all mine! Get back in there! Down, down, down! Go, go, go! Mine, mine, mine!
And add to the fact, how is it okay for Moore to base his Watchmen characters off of heroes from Charlton Comics, who were originally to be the basis of Watchmen before the concept changed in development, but it's an insult for others to build upon his versions of the characters? I'm pretty sure Captain Atom co-creator and artist Steve Ditko, who also co-created and drew for Spider-Man with Stan Lee, didn't intend for his creation to be going around where you can see his schlong. And to add further insult, Moore actually put forth that if people go and read before Watchmen, those people shouldn't read any of his work ever again. I'm sorry, what? No, Alan, no. That is not how it works. You don't get to tell consumers, your fans who have made you rich, what they can or cannot buy with their own goddamn hard-earned money. You and nobody else in the entire world has that right. But moving from that, we're supposed to be talking about film adaptations. Well, of course, there's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a movie so bad it got Sean Connery to retire from acting. No, seriously. Connery got into many conflicts with the director, and once when asked where the director was, Connery supposedly replied, "Check the local asylum." He hasn't acted since, disgusted with the state of the Hollywood system. Well, he did do, this. As for Alan Moore, of course he distanced himself from this one. What did you expect? But what about something like the Wachowski brothers written and produced adaptation of V for Vendetta, starring Hugo Weaving and Natalie Portman? This is another one I haven't actually seen, though I did want to when it was out, but from what I've heard, it was pretty well received. Moore's response? Well, after the travesty of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, he of course distanced himself from the production, having no involvement in its writing, and having issues over apparent changes in political agenda from the book to the screen, in the end refusing to have his name attached to the film. However, the V for Vendetta graphic novel's co-creator and artist David Lloyd supported the film, saying that Moore would only ever truly be happy with a complete book-to-screen adaptation. Oh, really? Well, let's just see about that. Cause then of course there was Watchmen, directed by the man who in my opinion ruined Superman, Zack Snyder. Although I did enjoy this work. This movie's consensus seems to be split down the middle. People either enjoyed it or hated it. Much as I disliked Snyder's work on Man of Steel, I think he really tried to be faithful with this one. Much like in 300, panels from the Watchmen graphic novel were literally used as storyboards, and the comic was virtually the script itself. He clearly wanted to get as much of the story as possible into this. There's a theatrical cut, a director's cut, a side movie, Tales of the Black Freighter, an animated adaptation of a comic within a comic in the Watchmen graphic novel, and even an ultimate edition that combines both the director's cut and Tales of the Black Freighter together into one movie as depicted in the comic. Give that man an A for effort. Of course, there were some small changes to the story.
They made Watchmen without the slimy squid.
And they obviously couldn't put in all those fake book excerpts such as Under the Hood between chapters, making up for it with an Under the Hood mockumentary included on certain DVDs and Blu-rays. But all in all, I thought it was an extremely faithful adaptation. As for more, well, Watchmen comic book artist Dave Gibbons supported the film, serving as an advisor, but Moore once again refused to have his name attached. He's pretty much of the consensus that Watchmen is simply an unfilmable story. Well, that's what J.R.R. Tolkien thought of Lord of the Rings, and look how that came out. But the real nail in the coffin is that Moore refuses to even watch the film. Hey, Alan, here's a bit of advice. Before you go judging something, why don't you at least watch the damn thing first, and then form an opinion on whether or not it holds up on its own?
The streets are extended gutters, and the gutters are full of blood. And when the drains finally scab over, all the vermin will drown. The accumulated filth of all their sex and murder will foam up about their waist, and all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us!" And I'll look down and whisper, "No."
Good night, children, and sweet dreams, wherever you are.
Now let's come to a little cult classic known as The Neverending Story. A German co-production directed by Wolfgang Petersen, it's based on the book by German novelist Michael Ende. How did he feel about the cult classic? Do you really need to ask? Oh my god, him and this movie. He felt just about everything was wrong. Granted, the movie did end halfway through the book, which the sequel tried and failed to correct, but some of the stuff he was asking for, well, listen for yourself.
Das Wichtigste in diesem Film wäre natürlich gewesen, ein Phantasien hinzustellen, das wirklich Fantasie, die Welt der Fantasie zeigt. Dazu ist zu sagen, was an Fantasie in diesem Film enthalten ist, das übersteigt kaum das Niveau eines mittleren Nachtclubs. Es fehlt eigentlich im Interieur des Elfenbeinturms nur noch die Glitzerkugel an der Decke und eine Girltruppe, die auftritt, und schon wären wir mitten in einem Nachtclub. Alles, was geheimnisvoll, magisch hätte sein müssen, ist total platt und banal geworden. Der Elfenbeinturm selbst wird in diesem Film gezeigt als eine Art Fernsehturm mit 3 Richtantennen, ich weiß nicht warum. Die Sphinxen sind wohl mit einer der größten Peinlichkeiten in diesem Film. Es handelt sich um ein paar vollbusige Stripperinnen, die da in der Wüste sitzen. Vollends Orgien des Kitsches werden gefeiert im letzten Teil des Films im Zimmer, im Raum der kindlichen Kaiserin, die auf einem gesteppten Hollywood-Bett sitzt. Es fehlt sogar nicht einmal die Muschel im Hintergrund. Es ist einfach unsäglich. Es ist eine unsägliche Geschichte daraus geworden.
Wow. Tell us how you really feel, Michael. I mean, were we watching the same movie? He compares the ivory tower interior to a nightclub? Really? I can sort of see his point about it looking like a TV tower, but it's still a unique design. Some of the most unique designs come from looking at other things. The Millennium Falcon was designed off of a half-eaten hamburger with an olive sitting next to it. Okay, I can grant that maybe the Sphinxes shouldn't have been bare-breasted in a PG movie, but everything he's complaining about, he probably wouldn't have been happy unless he designed every single thing himself. Early in the film's development, Michael and Wolfgang Petersen worked together on the script, with Michael saying, "I worked as an advisor because I wanted a beautiful movie. I trusted them." He later accused Petersen of secretly rewriting the screenplay, saying, "I saw the final script 5 days before the premiere and only as a result of a judicial verdict in Munich. I was horrified. They had changed the whole sense of the story. Fantastica, the novel's name for the film's Fantasia, reappears with no creative force from Bastian. For me, this was the essence of the book. I thought it was pretty clear that Bastian used his powers to whisk Fantasia back into existence. Not surprisingly, Michael was yet another bitter author who refused to have his name attached to the adaptation. But now let's conclude with adaptations of the works of Roald Dahl, especially one in particular. Now, I freaking love Roald Dahl, but he was never particularly fond of adaptations of his works. To my knowledge, the only one he ever genuinely enjoyed was the animated adaptation of the BFG. No, not that BFG, we're talking about the Big Friendly Giant here. Supposedly, after Dahl saw his first screening of that film, he stood up and applauded. But then there's films like The Witches, starring Angelica Houston, Rowan Atkinson, and produced and featuring the effects of Jim Henson. Sadly, this was the last motion picture Henson personally worked on before his tragic death. Dahl himself passed away the year this was released, but he did experience it. His response? Now, I should point out that while faring poorly at the box office, it was well received critically and is another on our list with a perfect 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. But Dahl in this film, good God! For a man at the end of his life, he was so ungodly against this film, to the point where he would picket outside of movie theaters with a megaphone telling people not to go see it. Really, the only thing in the movie Dahl approved of was the casting of Angelica Houston as the Grand High Witch, which he was absolutely ecstatic over, and was always his first choice. But it seems the real root of his hatred was giving the boy a name, Luke, and by working in a happy ending where a disgruntled witch arrives and turns the boy, who had been turned into a mouse, back into a boy. In the book, he was to have lived the rest of his days as a mouse. Now, people are often divided over this kind of thing. They either want a happy ending or a bittersweet ending. The movie version of the musical stage adaptation of Little Shop of Horrors is notorious that it was originally filmed with the stage's bittersweet ending, where Seymour and Audrey are both eaten by the plant, and giant plants take over the world. But test audiences became so enchanted by Seymour and Audrey that they hated this ending, so the filmmakers rushed to film a new happy ending. But there are people who prefer a bittersweet ending, and it seems Dahl was one of them in this particular case. And I can understand that. But Roald, come on, this is all over the ending? You know, I couldn't stand The Dark Knight Rises' hair-pulling ending, but that aside, I still enjoyed the film. One out-of-place element is going to ruin the film for you? Talk about high standards. But the real highlight of our Roald Dahl portion is his response to, say it with me, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Yes, Roald Dahl loathed Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, to the point that he flat out disowned it. His first issue came with the casting of Gene Wilder instead of his personal choice, Spike Milligan. And even though Dahl's credited as screenwriter, his script was ultimately rewritten by David Seltzer after he failed to meet deadlines. Now, that can sound like a dick move from one point of view, but it also sounds like Dahl's own fault if he couldn't make deadlines. He also felt the film had too much emphasis on Willy Wonka than on Charlie. Really? Wonka doesn't even show up until the second act. This is usually argued the other way around, with people saying the Tim Burton adaptation had too much Wonka emphasis. Also, he was infuriated by Seltzer's additional plot elements, such as the Slugworth subplot and the fizzy lifting drinks scene, though to be fair, that whole thing was actually alluded to in the book. They discussed fizzy lifting drinks, and they explained that you have to belt to get down. So, Dahl just didn't want to see it? This is a guy who applauded an animated film with a musical number all about farting. Maybe he just didn't want it utilized as a scene to make Charlie prove his worth at the end and thus earn his reward instead of having it just given to him. Okay? Anyway, Dahl hated this film so much he refused the rights to allow a movie of the book's sequel, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, at least not in his lifetime. It seems to be taken to heart since even the Tim Burton film didn't seem to have the book's sequel hook. Speaking of which... Now, there's no way to say what Dahl might have felt about posthumous adaptations of his work, like James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, or even Fantastic Mr. Fox. But then there's Tim Burton's adaptation of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Now, this film gets a bad rep from fans of the Gene Wilder film, and with good reason. It's a very different film. But here's the funny thing. Dahl's widow, Felicity, and daughter, Lucy, had full creative control of the film rights. And I would think his closest family would understand his opinions and his likes and dislikes better than anyone. In fact, in pre-production, Tim Burton visited Dahl's former home, where he entered Rawls' old shabby writing shed and remarked, "This is the Bucket's house," to which Dahl's widow's immediate thought was, "Thank God somebody gets it." Now, you can't deny Burton an A for effort for the film, especially since he had such strong approval from Dahl's own family.
When I went to Pinewood and saw the whole of the Pinewood lot covered in Wonka, I knew if Roald had seen that, he would have just said, "This is what I had in my mind."
And he did try to remain faithful to the book. Though not perfectly. I thought Wonka's backstory and issues with his father were rather pointless.
All books have to be changed for making a film, and these certainly enhance them.
Okay, good point. Though the Oompa Loompas could have been a bit more interesting than an army of Deep Roys. But then you get opinions from people like none other than Gene Wilder, who for a while refused to see Burton's version and recently came out and called it an insult, saying, "I don't care for that director. He's a talented man, but I don't care for him doing stuff like he did." Now, hold up. I love Gene Wilder, but correct me if I'm wrong, isn't it a little out of place to say those kind of things about a franchise that's not yours? I mean, yeah, you acted in it, Gene. It's one of your most memorable, cherished roles. But does that make it yours? Who did Burton insult? You? He certainly wasn't insulting Dahl, you know, the guy who wrote the damn thing. I don't know, maybe I'm just getting offended easily. So that's that. Pretty bizarre cases, right? Now, I want to ask you, the viewers, do you think these authors were justified in their hatred? Or do you think they were just bitter or egotistical? In fact, let me know of any film adaptations that were received poorly, but their authors kind of respected, and we can discuss those another time. I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but I want to hear from you. So until next time, this is MC Squared signing out, and have a Happy New Year! Watchmen was something that stood on its own and had the integrity of a